The wind on Mount Tanigawa doesn't whisper, it screams, a constant wailing reminder that this brutal, beautiful fortress of rock and ice does not forgive. It is a place where men vanish without a trace, where falling snow erases all evidence of a life in minutes. Yet some stories refuse to be buried, no matter how hard the blizzard tries. This is not merely a tale of mountain tragedy. It is the story of a military exercise that went horribly wrong, of a platoon that never came home, and the chilling, persistent legend that they are still up there, forever standing watch in the snow, a phantom army eternally on duty. Our story begins not in the deep snows of winter, but in the humid, desperate heat of 1944, as the war in the Pacific was turning. The Imperial Japanese Army, once an unstoppable force, was facing relentless pressure, and every soldier and resource was pushed to its absolute limit. The need for elite, hardened troops who could operate in the most extreme conditions brought a platoon of young, dedicated soldiers to the slopes of Mount Tanigawa, a place the locals ominously called the Mountain of Death. Their mission was a brutal, high-altitude winter warfare training exercise designed to forge them into unbreakable weapons through sheer suffering and discipline. The first day dawned clear and bitterly cold, with the sun glinting deceptively off the pristine snow. The men, laden with heavy packs and rifles, began their ascent, their breath pluming in the air as the crunch of their boots on the frozen crust was the only sound besides the ever-present wind. They moved with purpose, a line of dark figures against an endless expanse of white, establishing a base camp with tents that stood out like bright, fragile flowers against the immense gray rock face. That first night, as the temperature plummeted, hushed stories began to circulate among the junior officers.
An older local guide hired to assist them whispered warnings of the Kuchisake-Onna, the snow woman who leads men to their doom, and of other, older spirits of the mountain that deeply resented this intrusion. The young soldiers, products of a modern militaristic education, largely laughed off these superstitions, confident in their training, their discipline, and their emperor. They believed that bullets and bravery were a match for any ghost, a fatal underestimation of the ancient power they were confronting, viewing the mountain not as a living entity, but as a mere obstacle to be conquered. On the second day, the weather shifted with a terrifying swiftness. The sky turned from a brilliant blue to a leaden gray, and the wind picked up, howling with a new predatory ferocity. Snow began to fall, lightly at first, then in thick, driving sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet, creating a disorienting, vertigo-inducing whiteness that erased the world. Instead of calling off the exercise, the stern, disciplined commanding officer saw the storm not as a threat, but as the ultimate test of his men's fortitude and obedience. The officer made the fateful decision to order the platoon to continue a simulated patrol along a treacherous ridge notorious for its sudden, deadly avalanches. The men, conditioned to obey without question, formed up and tied a rope line between them as a literal lifeline before stepping out into the raging white void. We can only imagine the coiling fear in their guts, a fear they could never show, as they moved forward into the roaring chaos, each step taking them deeper into the mountain's icy grip and further from any hope of rescue.
Then came the sound that was not the wind, a deep, grinding rumble that vibrated through the very rock beneath their feet, a profound noise that signaled the mountain itself was waking up. High on the ridge above them, a massive, unstable cornice of snow finally gave way with a single sharp crack that escalated into a thunderous roar. Thousands of tons of snow, ice, and rock broke loose, becoming a white tidal wave, a force of nature as impersonal and absolute as death itself. There was no time to run, no time to scream. The avalanche swept down the mountain face with unimaginable speed and power, engulfing the entire platoon in a churning, suffocating torrent. In less than a minute,
The roaring ceased, replaced by an eerie, absolute silence as the snow settled, smooth and unblemished once more. The entire platoon, every last man, had been wiped from the face of the mountain, leaving no trace, as if they had been plucked from existence by an invisible, indifferent hand. Days later, when the storm finally cleared, a desperate search party ascended the mountain to find nothing. No bodies, no scraps of torn fabric, no broken rifles. The official report would later list the men as missing, presumed dead, a sterile, bureaucratic epitaph for a horrific and collective end. The army, embarrassed by the catastrophic loss and needing to maintain wartime morale, quietly closed the case, leaving the families with only vague letters and the agony of not knowing the final fate of their sons and husbands.
But on Mount Tanigawa, the story was only just beginning to unfold. The first new account emerged the following winter from a group of experienced hunters tracking a rare siro near the same fatal ridge. Caught in a sudden squall, one hunter peered into the swirling snow and froze, witnessing dozens of figures standing in perfect military formation, clad in tattered Imperial Japanese Army uniforms, with pale, waxy faces and unblinking eyes staring straight ahead. The spectral figures were partially translucent, shimmering in and out of view with the gusts of snow, a silent, terrifying apparition. The hunters, men intimately familiar with the mountain's physical dangers, but not its supernatural echoes, watched in stunned silence before the phantom platoon faded away, leaving nothing but the howling wind. They fled the mountain, and their story spread through the local villages like a wildfire, seeding a legend that would grow with each passing year. Over the subsequent decades, the sightings continued with an unsettling regularity. Post-war climbers in the 1960s, pushing for new routes on the deadly face, reported similar phenomena. One seasoned alpinist, bivouacked on a narrow ledge, awoke in the night to the sound of marching footsteps crunching on snow that wasn't there, and upon unzipping his tent flap, saw the spectral soldiers marching past, their forms glowing with a faint, ethereal light.
The climber reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sorrow, not fear, as he observed the ghosts, their faces etched with an eternal, frozen resolve. In the 1970s, a university hiking club that had become lost was rescued after claiming a group of silent soldiers in outdated gear had pointed them toward a safe path before dissolving into the mist. These consistent accounts cemented the legend of the Phantom Army of Mount Tanigawa in the annals of Japanese mountain folklore. The nature of these phantoms invites profound questions about what they truly represent. Are they traditional yurei, ghosts bound to the earthly plane by the violence of their death and an unfinished duty? Their silent vigil a powerful spiritual residue of their final disciplined moments? Their repetitive, structured appearance suggests they are trapped in an endless loop, a permanent echo of the catastrophe that consumed them, forever playing out on the stage of their demise. Alternatively, they might be understood as an ikiryo, or a collective psychic imprint, a thought form born from the intense trauma, discipline, and unfulfilled mission of the young soldiers. This concept posits that the powerful emotions of their final moments, the fear, the duty, the resolve, were so potent they were seared into the very fabric of the landscape, creating a recording that plays back under certain conditions, visible to those who tread the same tragic ground.
Their unwavering military formation is the most telling detail of all. It speaks volumes about their conditioning, revealing that even in death they hold the line, maintaining the discipline that was drilled into them in life. They are not aggressive phantoms. They do not seek to harm the living who encounter them. They are simply present, a permanent, chilling monument to a forgotten military disaster, a platoon forever on patrol, forever waiting for the order to stand down that will never, ever come. The mountain itself is the silent keeper and the primary actor in this drama, a formidable entity that holds this secret within its rocky core and icy slopes. The same winds that shroud its peaks are the very winds that seem to carry the whispers and the marching footsteps of the lost platoon. To climb Tanigawa today is to confront not just an immense physical challenge, but a historical and spiritual one. To walk directly in the long, cold shadow of a tragedy that the land itself remembers and refuses to forget. Every unexpected gust of wind that feels like a cold breath on the neck, every strange sound that isn't quite the shifting of rock or ice makes a modern climber wonder and glance over their shoulder. You find yourself instinctively scanning the whiteouts, not for wildlife or other climbers, but for a line of dark, disciplined figures standing where no living person could possibly stand. And you listen intently for the phantom crunch of boots on snow that has long since melted away with the seasons.
The legend of the Phantom Army is a story that forces us to remember that some wounds, whether inflicted upon a single person or an entire nation, never truly heal. They simply become frozen in time, waiting for a witness to acknowledge their pain and their story. It is a narrative that blurs the line between history and folklore, between a documented tragedy and a living, breathing myth that continues to evolve and haunt the modern imagination. This enduring tale serves as a powerful, somber reflection on the nature of duty and the ultimate cost of war, even far from the traditional battlefield. These soldiers were casualties not of enemy fire, but of the brutal demands placed upon them. Their memory preserved not in official histories, but in the eerie, recurring visions on the mountainside. They are a testament to the idea that some events are so powerful they can transcend their moment in time, becoming a permanent part of the landscape's soul. Ultimately, the Phantom Platoon of Mount Tanigawa stands as a ghostly cenotaph, a memorial carved not from stone, but from memory and mist. They are a reminder of the young men who were consumed by the very elements they were sent to master, their lives extinguished in a sudden, white silence. Their eternal patrol ensures that they are not entirely forgotten, that their story, however tragic and mysterious, continues to be told on the screaming winds of the mountain they never left.
Listen, can you hear it? Not the wind, not the bells, but something else. A whisper on the edges of a storm. A shape moving where there should be no shape. For centuries, the people of Japan lived in the shadow of the sublime and terrible power of nature. The ground could split open without warning. The sea could rise up in a wall of black water to devour whole towns. The mountains could breathe fire, painting the night sky in shades of hell. And from this crucible of terror, from the collective nightmares of millions, they were born. Not gods, not demons, but something else. Cryptids. Monsters born not of fantasy, but of catastrophe. Their stories are not mere folk tales. They are the desperate, human attempt to give a name, a face, and a reason to the senseless chaos that fell from the skies and rose from the earth. This is the story of how the land itself, in its violent tremors and raging waters, gave birth to legends that would haunt Japan for centuries. Our story begins not with a creature, but with a cataclysm. The year is 1707. On the island of Honshu, the air has grown thick and heavy for days. A strange, suffocating silence hangs over the villages nestled in the shadow of the great volcano, Mount Fuji. The mountain, long revered as a sacred being, has been restless. Then, on the 28th of November, the world ends. Not with a single explosion, but with a roar that tears from the very bowels of the earth. The ground heaves like a stormy sea. Wooden houses splinter like twigs. But this is only the beginning.
For days, the sky darkens as Fuji vomits forth a torrent of ash and rock. A blizzard of black so thick it blots out the sun at noon. Day becomes night. The ash falls like a smothering blanket, crushing roofs, poisoning the rivers, burying the rice fields upon which life itself depends. They call it the Hoi eruption. And in its wake, as the survivors dig themselves out of the gray tomb their world has become, they begin to see things. Shapes in the lingering ash fog. They speak of a new kind of fear, a feeling of being watched by the mountain itself. They whisper a name, born from the choking dust and the despair. Oshilori Baba, the white powder hag. Imagine a lone farmer making his way through the twilight of an ash-gray afternoon. The path is unfamiliar, buried under feet of fine white powder. The familiar landmarks are gone. And then he sees her. An old, hunched woman, her skin and tattered kimono the same stark white as the fallen ash. She shuffles towards him, her movements unnervingly smooth, like a puppet on strings. She doesn't speak. She only extends a bony hand, offering him a handful of the very ash that is destroying his life. Some legends say, if you take it, you are cursed to wander the blighted landscape forever, lost and choking. Others say she is the personification of the eruption itself, a spectral refugee from the heart of the volcano, forever distributing her deadly, powdery gift. She was not a monster of claws and teeth, but one of silence and despair, a direct, anthropomorphized echo of the Hoey eruption's suffocating aftermath. But the earth was not the only source of terror. The sea, the great provider, could become a ravenous destroyer in an instant. For centuries, the fishermen of the coast lived with the knowledge that the ocean could claim them at any time. And from that deep existential fear, the umibozu was born.
Picture a fishing boat, far from shore on a day when the sea is unnervingly calm, a flat, oily mirror. Without warning, the water beside the vessel begins to swell, to bulge upwards. A massive, black, domed head, smooth and featureless like a giant monk's shaven scalp, breaks the surface. It is colossal, dwarfing the boat. This is the umibozu, the sea monk. It is a pillar of darkness, a void given form. Some accounts speak of a pair of large, luminous eyes set deep in that blackness. It rarely attacks immediately. Its terror is in its silent, looming presence. It is the embodiment of the calm before the storm, the sudden, impossible wave that appears from nowhere. The legends say if it speaks, its voice is a guttural, watery roar, and it may demand a barrel or a ladle. To the foolish sailor who offers one, the umibozu will use it to fill their boat with seawater, dragging them down into the abyss. The only escape is to give it a bottomless ladle, a trick of the mind to defeat a monster born of hopelessness. The umibozu was the sea's unpredictable fury given a face, a blank, priestly, terrifying face. It was the reason a fisherman would kiss the shore upon his return, grateful to have escaped not a storm, but the monk of the deep. Yet some cryptids were born not from a single event, but from a slow, creeping dread that permeated the social and physical landscape of the Edo period. As the cities grew, so did the shadows between the wooden houses. As the Tokugawa shogunate enforced its strict social order, new anxieties festered. And from this complex web of urban fear and natural mystery came one of the most enduring and bizarre figures, the Kasa Obake. In the rain-soaked streets of Edo, on a night when the lanterns cast long, dancing shadows, you might see it, a discarded, old-fashioned paper umbrella left to rot in an alleyway. But as you pass, it twitches. A single large eye opens in its oiled paper surface. From the handle, a long red tongue lolls out. And then it hops. On one leg, a wooden geta sandal now attached where the handle used to be, it comes tapping, tapping, tapping after you. Kasa Obake, the Tsukumogami. The belief was that any object, upon reaching its 100th year of existence, could develop a soul, a kami. And if that object had been used carelessly, thrown away without respect, its spirit would awaken, not with gratitude, but with a mischievous, often malevolent energy. But the Kasa Obake is more than a simple ghost story.
It is a cryptid born from the very materials and anxieties of its time. In the crowded, flammable cities of 18th and 19th century Japan, made almost entirely of wood and paper, objects were both essential and perilous. A single dropped lantern could spell doom for an entire district. The Kasa Obake is the revenge of the discarded, the forgotten. It is the fear of the old world pushing back against the new, a manifestation of the guilt felt for waste in a society where resources were often scarce. Its one leg symbolizes its incompleteness, its unnatural state of being.
It wasn't a monster from the wilderness, but one born in the very heart of human civilization, a warning from the objects we use every day. And then there were the monsters that walked among men, hidden in plain sight, the shapeshifters. And none were more feared or more deeply tied to the natural world's wild, untamable spirit than the kitsune and the tanuki. But we are not speaking of the playful tricksters of children's tales. We speak of their darker, more primal cousins, whose powers were directly linked to the forces of nature. A lone traveler, caught in a sudden violent downpour, seeks shelter in a small, remote house. A beautiful woman with sharp, intelligent eyes offers him warmth and food. She is gracious, her laughter like bells. But as the night deepens, the traveler notices something strange. Every time a log cracks in the fire, the woman flinches, a flicker of fear crossing her face that seems unnatural. And then, when she thinks he is asleep, he sees it, a glimpse of a bushy, red-tipped tail peeking from beneath her kimono. This is no ordinary woman. This is a nogitsune, a wild fox. Foxes were deeply associated with the rice god Inari, and thus with the fertility of the land itself. A good harvest meant life. A bad one meant starvation. A nogitsune could create kitsunebi, ghostly foxfire that led travelers astray into swamps or off cliffs, much like the will-o-wisps born from marsh goss. They were blamed for strange illnesses, kitsunetsuki, or fox possession, where a person would act erratically, craving foods a fox would eat. The kitsune was a cryptid of the borderlands, between the village and the wild, between a bountiful harvest and a devastating famine. Similarly, the tanuki, the raccoon dog, was a master of transformation. While often portrayed as jolly and foolish, its shape-shifting abilities spoke to a deeper, more unsettling truth about the landscape. A tanuki could transform its testicles into a vast silken curtain, a house, or even a whole landscape to deceive travelers. This bizarre ability is a direct metaphor for the deceptive nature of the world. A path in the forest that seems familiar could lead you in circles. A safe-looking valley could be a trap. The tanuki's power was the power of the land itself, to lie, to reshape itself, to confound human understanding. But of all the natural disasters, none struck a deeper chord of terror than the earthquake. Japan, sitting on the Pacific Ring of Fire, was and is a land perpetually in motion. And for a people who believed the world was carried on the back of a giant catfish, the explanation for these terrifying convulsions was both fantastical and perfectly logical. The Namazu. Beneath the islands of Japan, deep in the soft, muddy underworld, lies a colossal catfish, the Namazu. It is a restless, powerful beast, normally held in place by the god Takemiya Tsuchi, who pins its head with a mighty stone. But sometimes, the god is distracted or careless, and in that moment, the Namazu thrashes, and on the surface, the world tears itself apart. In the Great Ansei Edo earthquake of 1855, which flattened vast swaths of the city and killed thousands, the Namazu was not just a folktale, it became a scapegoat and a symbol. In the aftermath, a fascinating phenomenon occurred: Namazue, catfish pictures, woodblock prints that were sold on the streets like newspapers. These prints depicted the giant catfish being subdued by gods, or by everyday people like carpenters and blacksmiths, but they also contained a dark, satirical edge.
Some showed the Namazu not as a mindless beast, but as a world rectifier, punishing the wealthy and corrupt, and redistributing wealth as the disaster created a boom for construction workers and merchants. The Namazu was the perfect cryptid. It gave a tangible, understandable cause to the most inexplicable and violent of events. The shifting, unstable ground became the writhing of a giant creature. It was a monster that was also a necessary part of the world's order, a destructive force that, in a twisted way, could also bring about social and economic change. It was the earthquake, given flesh, scale, and fin. As the 19th century waned and Japan began to open its borders to the west, the old monsters did not disappear. They evolved. The shadows cast by gaslight were different from those cast by oil lamps, but they were shadows all the same. The industrial age brought new fears, but they were still grafted onto the old familiar dread of nature's power. The cryptids of Japan, born from tsunami, eruption, and quake, had become permanent residents of the national psyche. They were more than stories. They were a language, a framework for processing the trauma of existing in a land of breathtaking beauty and unimaginable violence. That whistle was the sound of a new Japan, a nation tearing itself from the feudal past and lunging headlong into the modern world. The Meiji Restoration, beginning in 1868, was more than a political revolution. It was a seismic shift in the very reality of daily life. Brick and stone buildings rose where wood and paper once stood. Gas lights and later electric lights pushed back the ancient shadows where the Kaso Abake and the Nogitsune had thrived. The clatter of the train replaced the rhythm of the horse. And with these changes came a new kind of logic, a Western scientific rationality that sought to explain the world without monsters.
But the old fears, the ones carved into the national psyche by centuries of cataclysm, did not simply vanish. They retreated, mutated, and found new forms in the fresh darkness cast by the modern age. In the newly renamed Tokyo, formerly Edo, a young scholar named Akira, educated in the West, walks with a sense of superiority. He carries a leather satchel filled with books on geology and meteorology. He scoffed at his grandmother's stories. The Namazu was a myth. Earthquakes were the result of tectonic plate shifts. He believed the light of reason was finally banishing the childish shadows of superstition. But then, in 1891, the Great Nobi earthquake struck. It was one of the largest in Japanese recorded history, a cataclysm that flattened entire cities and killed thousands. Akira was in a newly built, Western-style brick building in Nagoya when it hit. The experience was nothing like the wooden collapses of the old tales. This was a different kind of terror. The sound of brick and mortar, symbols of the new, unyielding Japan, cracking and grinding to dust. The world didn't just shake, it shattered. And in that moment of absolute rational chaos, as the laws of physics themselves seemed to break down, Akira's scientific certainty fractured. Buried in the rubble, choking in plaster dust that was strangely reminiscent of volcanic ash, he didn't think of tectonic plates. His mind, reaching for an anchor in the primal fear, conjured the old image, the giant catfish, thrashing in its subterranean prison, more powerful than any steam engine, more immense than any imported iron ship. The Namazu had not been banished by modernity. It had simply grown larger, strong enough to shatter the new world as easily as it had the old. When he was pulled from the wreckage, his first words were not of science, but a whispered, terrified confession to a rescue worker. The Namazu, it is angry with our progress. This was the new life for the old cryptids. They became symbols of nature's ultimate, unchallengeable power over man's fragile technological arrogance. The umibozu began to be sighted not just by fishermen in wooden junks, but by sailors on the new steel-hulled steamships. The reports changed slightly. The monster was now said to be darker than coal smoke, its roar mingling with the sound of a ship's boiler. It was the ocean reminding the empire that it still held dominion. Meanwhile, in the sprawling, soot-choked industrial districts of Osaka, the Tsukumogami found a terrifying new genesis.
The belief had always been that objects over 100 years old gained a soul. But what if the new, mass-produced objects of the industrial age? The folklore began to twist, to adapt. A new, chilling story began to circulate among the factory workers, men and women who felt like cogs in a vast, inhuman machine. A young woman named Hana worked 14-hour days in a textile mill. Her world reduced to the hypnotic, punishing rhythm of the machines. Her life was owned by the factory. One night, exhausted and half delirious, she was tasked with cleaning a particular loom that had been malfunctioning, a machine notorious for injuring workers. Its constant jarring noise sounded almost like a distorted, metallic laugh. As she cleaned, she swore she saw the faces of injured co-workers reflected in its polished metal parts. And then the loom shifted. Its levers and pulleys seemed to rearrange themselves for a moment, forming a ghastly metallic face that stared back at her with blank, gear-like eyes. It was a Kikai Obake, a machine ghost, a new type of Tsukumogami, born not from age and neglect, but from overuse, from the pain and suffering absorbed by the machine itself, from the very speed of this new, brutal industrial life. The monster had evolved from a discarded umbrella to a possessed, active instrument of toil. The horror was no longer about guilt for waste, but about the fear of the technology that now enslaved them. Even the kitsune and tanuki adopted. As the countryside was carved up by rail lines, stories emerged of foxes seen dancing on the tracks, their eyes reflecting the oncoming train's light, seemingly challenging this iron intruder. There were tales of tanuki, the masters of illusion, causing entire trains to see phantom stations or spectral landslides on the tracks, their ancient magic testing the limits of modern schedules and steel. The government of the new modern Japan, eager to present a civilized face to the West, actively discouraged these superstitions. Textbooks taught scientific explanations. Police sometimes arrested storytellers for spreading backwards rumors, but they were fighting a battle against the very soul of the land. The cryptids had sunk their roots too deep. They were not just stories, they were language, a framework for processing trauma, both old and new. By the dawn of the 20th century, Japan was a recognized world power, a modern empire.
But if you walked into a bookshop in Tokyo, you would find new editions of old ghost story anthologies, selling better than ever. If you listened in a rural inn near Mount Fuji, the elders still spoke of the white powder hag with a respectful fear. The cryptids had survived. They had woven themselves into the very fabric of the nation's identity, a dark, enduring thread connecting the Japan of the shoguns to the Japan of the emperor. They are the proof that while you can pave over the forests and light up the night, you cannot erase the memories whispered by the wind, or the shapes that move in the corner of your eye, born from a time when the world was a place of deeper shadows and the monsters had names. So the next time you walk through a silent, foggy forest, or stand on a shore where the water is a little too still, remember the stories. Remember the white powder hag, born of ash and despair. Remember the blank, staring face of the sea monk, rising from the deep. Remember the tapping of the one-legged umbrella in the alley and the shapeshifter watching you from the edge of the trees. These are not just monsters. They are memories. They're the echoes of 1,000 real disasters, the ghosts of 1,000,000 real fears. They are the voices of the land itself, whispering its long, turbulent history in the language of legends. And they are a warning that the line between the natural world and the supernatural is, in Japan, as thin as rice paper and just as easily torn. The ground you stand on may seem solid, but beneath it something stirs. The sea that feeds you may seem calm, but in its depths, something watches. The objects you use without a thought may one day remember your disrespect. This is the enduring legacy of Japan's cryptids.
a hauntingly beautiful and terrifying testament to the power of nature and the resilience of the human imagination in the face of the unknown. They remind us that fear can create its own reality, and that the stories we tell about the world around us are often just as real and just as powerful as the world itself.
From the volcanic eruptions of the 1700s to the industrial revolutions of the 1800s, these creatures have been constant, if shifting, companions. They are born from catastrophe, but they live on in culture, adopting to every new fear, every new anxiety that a changing world can produce. They are not relics, they are reflections. They show us ourselves and our deepest fears, mirrored back at us through the lens of myth and legend. In the end, the cryptids of Japan are more than just folklore. They are a fundamental part of understanding the Japanese relationship with nature, a relationship defined by both reverence and terror. They teach us that in a land where the earth can betray you at any moment, it is perhaps a natural human response to populate that earth with creatures that explain its wrath, that give a form to its chaos, and that, in their own strange way, make the unbearable somehow comprehensible. So let the wind whisper, let the shadows dance, and listen closely, for the past is not dead. It is alive in the stories we tell, in the monsters we imagine, and in the enduring, unshakable power of the land to inspire both awe and dread in the hearts of those who call it home. The cryptids of Japan are waiting, just beyond the edge of the light, forever born from the cataclysm, forever haunting the border between our world and the one that lies just beneath. Their tales are etched not in stone, but in the collective memory of a people who have learned to live with beauty and danger in equal measure. They are the children of fire and water, of earth and air, and they will continue to evolve as long as the mountains breathe and the seas rage. This is their story, and it is far from over. It is a story that continues to be written with every tremor, every storm, and every new shadow cast by the modern world. A timeless narrative of the monsters we create to explain the world, and the world that, in turn, creates the monsters within us.
The creak of a floorboard in an empty house, the faint, cold scent of a meal cooked over 2 centuries ago, left to congeal on a low wooden table. A single, small gaita sandal lying on its side in the dirt path, as if the child who'd been kicking it along had simply evaporated into the autumn air. This is the silence that fell over the village of Kobayuchi. Not a peaceful silence, a stolen one. It was the 12th day of the 9th month, in the 4th year of the Onna era, late October 1779. In the remote, mist-shrouded mountains of Aomori Prefecture, the village of Kobayuchi was a cluster of perhaps 24 wooden homes with thatched roofs clinging to the rugged slopes. It was a place defined by the rhythm of the seasons, by the planting and harvesting of buckwheat, by the deep, ancient forests that pressed in from all sides. The people here lived by the grace and the whim of the mountain, and they knew its every mood, or so they thought. The morning of the disappearance was, by all accounts later whispered, unremarkable. The sun rose, pale and weak over the peaks. Smoke began to curl from hearths. The village headman, a stern, weathered man named Jiro, looked up at the slopes of Mount Kamuri, its peak already dusted with an early snow, and felt a familiar low thrum of anxiety. The harvest had been poor. Not disastrously so, but enough to make the winter ahead a long and lean one. Still, life went on. His daughter, Kimi, a girl of 16 with clever hands, was in the family's field, carefully harvesting the last of the radishes. She paused, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek, and looked towards the forest line. She thought she saw a flicker of movement, a shape that was not quite a tree, a color that was the deep, impossible white of old bone. She blinked, and it was gone. The trick of the light, she told herself.
The mountain spirits were restless, that was all. They often were at this time of year. Down in the village, the carpenter, Kenji, was hammering a new plank onto his shed. The sound echoed sharp and clear through the valley. His wife, Sato, was inside their home, stirring a pot of millet and mountain vegetables. The scent was hearty, simple. She hummed an old folk song, one her own grandmother had taught her, a melody about a fox who fell in love with the moon. Next door, the children, too young for the fields, were playing a game of tag, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the solemn calls of the crows. This is the scene you must hold in your mind. A living, breathing community. A completely ordinary day.
But the mountain had been speaking, and few had been listening. For weeks there had been signs, an unusual number of landslides on the higher trails, blocking paths used by hunters. The village's single Shinto shrine, dedicated to the kami of Mount Kamuri, had been found with its sacred rope, the Shimenawa, snapped and lying on the ground. The local priest, an old man who claimed to dream the dreams of the mountain, had become increasingly withdrawn, his mutterings about a great hunger and a debt coming due dismissed as the ramblings of age. The debt. That was the heart of it. The folklore of this region was thick with stories of the Yama no Kami, the god of the mountain. It was a capricious deity, neither purely good nor evil, but powerful and demanding of respect. It provided the trees for shelter, the game for food, the pure water from its springs. But it demanded something in return. Silence, reverence, and occasionally a sacrifice. Not always a ritual offering of an animal or rice wine. Sometimes, the stories whispered, the mountain demanded a different kind of payment. A silent sacrifice. One would that not be announced with drums and prayer, but one that would simply be taken. The afternoon wore on. Kenji finished his work and went inside, sitting cross-legged on the tatami mat, waiting for his meal. Sato placed the steaming bowl in front of him. He grunted his thanks. Outside, the children's game had broken up, and one little boy, Taro, was sitting on a stump, trying to fix a broken toy cart. His mother had called him once, her voice sharp, telling him to come in and wash up. He'd ignored her, his small fingers fumbling with a piece of twine. That was the last sound. A mother's call unanswered. The clatter of a wooden bowl as Sato set it down. The rhythmic scrape of Kimi's hoe in the hard earth. Then, nothing. Not a scream, not a crash, not a roar. Just a profound, absolute, and total silence that fell over Kobayashi like a shroud. 2 days later, a traveling merchant named Haisuke, who made the difficult journey to Kobayashi once a season to trade salt and needles for dried fish and woven baskets, found the village. He came down the mountain path, his pack heavy on his shoulders, expecting to hear the familiar sounds of life. But there was only the wind. He saw the first house, its door swinging open on its hinges. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the immense quiet. He peered inside. A low table was set. 2 bowls of congealed grayish millets had upon it. Chopsticks were laid neatly to the side, unused. A cup of cold tea. It was as if the inhabitants had been summoned away at the very moment they were about to eat. Puzzled, and now with a cold knot tightening in his stomach, Haisuke moved to the next house, and the next. Every home was the same. Meals left uneaten. Hearth fires long dead, nothing but cold ash. A half-mended kimono lay on a sleeping mat, a needle still threaded and stuck into the fabric. In the carpenter's shed, Kenji's tools were laid out neatly, as if he were about to return to his work. But there were no people, no bodies, no signs of a struggle, no blood. It was as if every single man, woman, and child, perhaps 60 souls in total, had simply stood up and walked into the mountain air,
vanishing between one heartbeat and the next. Haisuke's breath came in ragged pants, his fear now a living thing in his throat. He ran to the headman's house. It was just as still. Jiro's ledger, where he recorded village taxes and rice yields, lay open, the inkstone dry beside it. And then Haisuke saw it. On the path outside, a single child's sandal. It was the only thing out of place in the entire, terrifyingly orderly scene. Haisuke did not stay another moment. He fled, stumbling back up the mountain path, his pack abandoned, his heart hammering against his ribs. He did not stop until he reached the next village, where he collapsed, babbling a story of a ghost village, of a people stolen by the yokai, the demons of the mountain. The news traveled, as such news always does, from village to village, growing and distorting with each telling. It reached the ears of the local magistrate, a samurai named Tanaka, a pragmatic man who served the Tokugawa shogunate. He was a man of order, of records, of taxes. A village could not simply vanish. It was an administrative impossibility. He gathered a small contingent of his men and made the journey to Kobeuchi. What he found unnerved him to his core. He confirmed Haisuke's story in every chilling detail. The silent houses, the uneaten meals, the utter lack of any rational explanation. There was no evidence of bandit attack. No valuables were missing, no homes were ransacked. There was no sign of disease, no bodies, no stench of death. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. A village that was on his tax rolls, a producer of rice and labor, was now a void. Magistrate Tanaka was a loyal servant of the shogunate, and he understood one thing above all else. Panic is a contagion more dangerous than any plague. The Tokugawa regime had maintained its rigid control over Japan through a policy of absolute stability. Stories of cursed mountains and vanishing villages could shatter that stability. They could cause unrest. They could make people question the order of things. So he made a decision, a cold, calculated political decision. He ordered his men to secure the village, not to investigate, but to erase. They boarded up the houses. They gathered the few wandering livestock and disposed of them. And then Magistrate Tanaka sat down at the headman's own table and composed his report. It did not mention silent sacrifices or uneaten meals. It stated, simply and officially, that the village of Kobeuchi, due to its remote location and unsustainable population, had been formally disbanded. Its residents had been relocated. It was a lie, of course, a clean administrative lie. But the erasure did not stop there. In the Grand Cartographic Archives of the Shogunate in Edo, the official maps of the Aomori region were carefully updated. The tiny inked-in characters that spelled out Kobeuchi were scraped away from the vellum. The lines denoting its paths were redrawn to show only untouched forest. Within a year, as far as the government was concerned, the village of Kobeuchi had never existed at all. Yet, you cannot so easily scrape a story from the human heart. In the villages that dotted the valleys around Mount Kamuri, the memory of Kobeuchi lived on. It curdled from a historical event into dark folklore. The old priest's mutterings were remembered and given new, terrifying weight. The story solidified, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter in hushed tones by the fireside.
They said the mountain kami was not just restless, but angry. The poor harvests of recent years were a warning. The people of Kobeuchi had perhaps failed in their reverence. Maybe they had cut down a sacred tree. Maybe they had hunted a creature that was under the kami's protection. Or maybe the debt was simply older, a generational promise that had come due. The kami demanded a silent sacrifice, not a ritual killing, but a claiming. It would take the entire village all at once, absorbing them back into the soil, the rock, the very spirit of the mountain. This is where the story would end, as a perfect, unnerving folktale, if not for the slow, patient work of historians and geologists, piecing together the truth from the fragments the shogunate left behind. Cross-referencing the few surviving pre-erasure maps with modern geological surveys, a clear and horrifyingly rational picture begins to emerge. The village of Kobeuchi was not just at the foot of Mount Kamuri. It was situated directly beneath a massive, unstable slope, a layer of weak shale and soil that had been saturated by unusually heavy, persistent rains that autumn. The silence that Hisake and Magistrate Tanaka encountered was not supernatural. It was the silence after. The event was not a slow-moving famine or a plague, but something instantaneous, catastrophic, a landslide. Not a rumbling, grinding slide that would have given warning. This would have been a phenomenon known as a debris flow, a sudden liquefaction of the entire mountainside, a wall of mud, rock, and trees moving with the speed and force of a freight train. It would have hit Kobeuchi with no more than a deafening, all-consuming whoosh. It would have buried every house, every path, every single person in a tomb of wet earth and stone in a matter of seconds. It would have explained the uneaten meals, the disaster struck at dusk, the moment of the evening meal. It would have explained the lack of bodies. They were buried under dozens of feet of debris, a mass grave sculpted by nature itself. It would have explained the sandal, swept from a child's foot by the unimaginable force of the flow. The shogunate's surveyors would have seen the raw, scarred face of the mountain and understood immediately that the village was gone. Not just depopulated, but physically obliterated.
The decision to relocate it, on paper, was a cover-up. Not for a mystery, but for a natural disaster so complete and terrifying that acknowledging it could cause widespread fear in a region dotted with similar mountain villages. The folklore of the silent sacrifice, then, is a human masterpiece of psychological coping. The truth that the very ground beneath your feet could, without warning, rise up and swallow you whole was too random, too senseless, too horrifying to accept. It was easier, somehow more comforting, to believe in a capricious god. A deity, however cruel, has a reason. It operates on a logic of debt and payment. A landslide has no mind, no motive. It is pure, indifferent chaos. So, the memory of Kobeuchi lives on in two forms. In the cold, silent archives of a fallen government, it is a bureaucratic ghost, a line item struck from a ledger. And in the misty valleys of Aomori, it is a chilling campfire story, a warning to always respect the mountain, lest it demand its payment once more. The truth is that the villagers of Kobeuchi did not vaporize from memory. They were buried by it, first by mud and then by lies, and finally by the stories we tell ourselves to make the unbearable darkness just a little easier to face.